start the questions, get a little bit more detail, drill down. Appreciate all of your opening remarks, but we need to have a little bit more detail if we could. So my first question is going to be to Ms. Balkis and Mr. Gillespie, and we'll probably start with you, Ms. Balkis. You know, you've talked about the actions that each of you have been taking in these areas, but I'd like you to both be real specific and detail the steps that you're taking to actually coordinate these efforts with state, local, and tribal governments. How are you working together? And be as specific as you can. Give me some ideas in the committee.
Chairman Peters, I think we're doing extensive collaboration in the area, but there's always room for improvement. What we're currently doing is we regularly coordinate with both the state and our federal partners. We're in contact on a weekly basis. We use collaborative software to post and share draft documents for state regulatory review with EGLE. And those documents are posted on the online Air Force administrative record that's available to government agencies as well as the public. We engage with our state regulators or EGLE partners through the BRAC cleanup team, where Air Force and EGLE state regulator representatives have open and frank conversations about the environmental cleanup strategies, our pre-decisional draft documents to address comments or questions between the agencies and facilitate the investigation and cleanup process. We also discuss planned field work and the subsequent results to ensure we have a common understanding of the work and to minimize any data gaps. With regard to tribal coordination, the Air Force is looking forward to expanding our consultation opportunities to include access and coordination. Our installations work on a government-to-government basis with our tribes if actions are needed on their land, and we seek their permission to access their land and to carry out our cleanup actions. I have regular meetings at my level with US EPA in Washington, DC on the CERCLA side. And in fact, I spoke with Greg Gervais last week. So I'm personally engaged in that collaboration in the 4 months that I've been in the job, and our broader team through the Air Force Civil Engineer Center and the BRAC cleanup team have additional details that I'm happy to let Mr. Gillespie fill you in on.
Right, Mr. Gillespie?
Yes, sir. I work in the technical branch, of course, right? And I want to hit this, your point, sir, on 2 levels. One is on the broader level, we work closely with US EPA and other government agencies on trying to really find new technologies that will address PFAS. We have a very good history, although it took 40 years to really kind of wrap up the TCE issue that started at Wordsmith Air Force Base here in Michigan, right? The first base in the inventory to get hit with TCE. So we're almost there with new technologies coming out. We're field testing a lot of technologies with different partners. We're about 3 to 5 years out to get the next level of technologies online. Of course, the technologies we're using right now, which are off the shelf, is the GAC units and the resins. On a different focus on how do we get these projects done. I work projects across the United States. One thing we can do a better job of here in Michigan, particularly Wordsmith, is I see a lot of meetings that we have, technical get-together. A lot of it's contractual talk, schedule talk, things like that. I'm a little disappointed and we don't have that face-to-face, just technical. People enter the room, put their policies aside, and let's talk technical, because what we owe the public is we owe them that we understand the subsurface infrastructure. We have got to agree on that. If we, the stakeholders, do not agree on the subsurface infrastructure, what that geology looks like, then we're always going to be arguing. And so I think we could do a better job on working with our regulatory stakeholders in technical meetings and have those more administrative meetings at a different time. Secondly, I think we can do a better job with the public. There's a lot of people, particularly at Wordsmith, that are very astute on technology, on hydrogeology, and I think they're more yearning for that type of information. And I asked the people who are doing the work at Wordsmith, including our contractors, and they said, well, we do that, but it was a poster session. you know, and people would come in, look at the posters or whatever. But I think what the people want, at least this is what I heard, is they would really like just meet at the library, spend at least 2-3 hours and go, you know, we might only get 5 people there, but at least we could explain to them where we're coming from, both Eagle and Air Force, where we're coming from in our understanding of the subsurface and how that water moves. Sir.
Well, that sounds great. So my question, you think this is something we should do to improve the process? Why has that not happened, and how can we put some action steps to make that a reality?
I think we can make it happen, sir. I've done it other bases. Ms. Balkus and I, 25 years ago, the biggest environmental issue for the Air Force was the Massachusetts Military Reservation, MMR, and we threw the kitchen sink at it. And now it's a stabilized program, although PFAS has showed up there too. However, that was a big program with a lot of problems. And I think it's throwing the kitchen sink at it.
Okay, so we'll follow up with you to make that. Ms. Balkus, how can we improve collaboration? You mentioned actually in your response, we can do better. So elaborate on what Mr. Gillespie said and go beyond that if you have other ideas, please.
Yes, sir. Senator Peters, I think a couple of areas where we can improve, and I'm willing to commit today that we indeed set up a community meeting where I can bring John and a couple of our other experts. I've got Caitlin S. here with me in the audience today, who's my executive director for PFAS in particular. She also is from Michigan. And so 2 locals that completely understand the environment here, the communities here, grew up here, I think would be better than me, a policymaker, trying to share the technical details. So that's my commitment, is to bring our experts in, have a meeting, go through the level of detail that John is familiar with and can articulate very easily, allow anyone that has interest to come into that meeting. There's no requirements, there's no specificity, just make it at a location where everyone can get access to it. That's my commitment that I would make here today.
That's great. Well, I love commitments being made today. That's good. Thank you. Hope this is a good conversation. Just keep going. We'll go on a roll here with commitments. So, but thank you for that. Mr. Piggott, you're clearly a leader in PFAS response, and I'd like you to elaborate on EPA's plans to help our state agencies use the best practices and empower local folks to be a part of the decision-making process. That's something that has been lacking. We need to do a better job. How can we do that? What are you doing? And you're free to make any commitments you'd like as well.
Well, first of all, I want to say we are committed, and I'm happy to commit to continued coordination with the state of Michigan, and particularly our partners in Eagle. You know, when we issued the health advisories, we made a commitment to reaching out to the states and the communities and the organizations that would be affected by this, to both explain the basis for those health advisories, but also to follow up and say, how can we, given this, what we've known now, how can we chart a path forward to ensuring that we clean up PFAS? And we've made a commitment at EPA to put in place drinking water regulatory tools to propose it by the end of this year and then finalize them next year. We've been working in a number of areas specifically with Michigan, and particularly with our technical folks. We've worked to characterize fume suppressants at chromium electroplating facilities throughout the state of Michigan, managed to characterize those. And because of our partnership with Eagle, they've used that information to work with those facilities to help reduce the PFAS at those facilities by, it's my understanding, 90%. It's that kind of upstream work that'll help deliver on our commitment to ensure that we restrict PFAS from entering our water bodies in the first place. In addition to that, we've been developing methods to characterize and analyze PFAS in the foams that we see in lakes around Michigan. How much PFAS is in those foams, and how can we characterize it? And we've been working with our partners in Michigan to do that. And that's just part of the effort. If we're going to really commit to do this, we have a federal partnership as well and have been working in a number of areas. I cannot say enough about the ATSDR relationship with EPA and the funding they provided to conduct studies, to get tools in place to ensure that we understand the toxicological profile of these pollutants, and then collaborate on chemical class-based evaluations. As you know, the PFAS are a large group of chemicals. It may be easier to deal with them and regulate them in a way that approaches them by class. And we've been committed to working together, all of us, to do just that and to explore ways to do that. We've been working with DOD to put in place and collaborated to put in place testing methodologies that resulted in the 1633 testing methodology, and worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to ensure that we accurately characterize the PFAS that's in fish tissue. So we're concerned both about working with our communities at the state level, working with our federal partners to better understand PFAS and remediate it, and then also address it and prevent it from getting into the environment in the first place.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Bracey, the ATSDR is, my understanding, currently working with state partners and investigating exposure in about 30 communities across our country, including areas here in Michigan, Camp Grayling, the former Wordsmith Air Force Base, and the former Wolverine Worldwide Tannery. So my question for you is, could you please detail the collaboration that you are working with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and how that collaboration is going, and kind of the results of this partnership? Bottom line, what do you think are the most significant results?
Yeah, so thank you very much for that question. So first of all, I want to recognize that, as you said in your introductory remarks, Michigan has identified such a large number of sources of exposure because they've looked. And we'd actually like to see that model be adopted more universally across the country right away, because the more you look, the more you find. The more you find, the more you have to understand kind of what the source of the exposure is and where that comes from. So we work with the state of Michigan to try and understand what those pathways are. Now, we do that at very specific sites where there's a known source of exposure, there's a known pathway, and there's perhaps a large enough population to be of concern. And I enumerated some of those sites in my comments at the beginning. And so the state of Michigan is a crucial partner in conducting those site-specific investigations. So in the investigations, we go to the site like Wolverine, and we look at, where does the exposure come from? What are the pathways it gets to people? How many people are exposed and what the health risks are? We write a report trying to find that, primarily to inform the communities about what their risks are, and also to inform cleanup efforts, because we do this work in partnership with the Environmental Protection Agency. So the ATSDR and EPA work side by side, and we do these investigations going forward. Now, perhaps the most important collaboration ongoing right now is the collaboration with our multi-site health study. So that's a very unique effort. As many of you know, there was a large health study conducted at a DuPont site in Ohio and West Virginia, the so-called C8 study. And what we're trying to do is build on that study by a national study, the first ever national study looking at drinking water exposures and human health effects across the country. So I'm happy to say that the state of Michigan is one of the collaborators on that study going forward. It's one of the states that have probably been one of the sites that have been most successful at recruiting people for that study. Unfortunately, we don't have any results to share right now. These things take time going forward. And so we're very excited about the opportunities that the multi-site health study provides and the leadership role that the state of Michigan plays in that.
Right. Well, you talked about some collaboration, and just as I asked our other panelists, are there things that can be improved when it comes to state, local, tribal governments? Are there areas that we can strengthen collaboration in your mind?
Absolutely. We can always do more, as you heard already. And so what we need to do is now help the state and local health departments try and understand the rapidly evolving science and the multiple new assessments that are occurring and what it means from them. So we need to help them understand, what does it mean now with the new health advisories? How do we incorporate that into our decision making? what does it mean now with the new advice that's coming out of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, when we have new guidance about clinical guidance for communities affected, including a recommendation that community members who think they've been exposed at significant levels should get their blood tested. And so those are new challenges. And I also mentioned that the science is changing even as these new guidances come out. So keeping up on the science is a challenge. So primarily, I think we need to work with state and local health departments to translate that information into actual changes in what we do on the ground, and how do we incorporate that into the decisions that we make at the local and state level. That's a big challenge.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. I actually want to pick up on that the recommendation, because I think it's great that to Mr. Haggett, how is the EPA, now that we have these advisories, how is the EPA communicating that with state, local, tribal, and working to ensure that we are actually moving forward in a dynamic and forceful way?
Mr. Chairman, as you know, communication isn't something you just do and it's over with. One of the things we realize at EPA is that communication has to be continual, and that as we do more scientific work, we're going to learn more about these PFAS chemicals. And as we learn more, it'll be incumbent upon us as agencies of the federal government to work closely with our state partners, but also to communicate on a regular basis with citizens in the country to better understand where we're at. And that was an example of the PFAS health advisories. You remember in 2017, when US EPA came out with the 70 parts per trillion health advisories. It wasn't until this year where we had the latest science, where we discovered that the health effects of PFAS occur at much lower levels than what we previously understood. It's communicating that information on a real-time basis. One of the questions we're asked often is, well, so why did you communicate these health advisories now? And it's our responsibility at EPA, as protector of human health and the environment, to ensure that when we have the latest information about the health effects of chemicals, that we release them to the public, because it's important, whether it's the federal government and the panel here today, or the state government in its effort to protect drinking water in the states, or the communities themselves, that they have the latest information that allows them and the individual to take action as they see fit. And our health advisories are not regulatory. They are not enforceable. And that's why we realize if we're going to work further, not just to collaborate and communicate regularly, but to take action to remove this from the environment, we've got work to do. And some of that work involves putting in place drinking water regulatory mechanisms. And that's what we call our drinking water MCLs. We're working to do that as well. But the communication about this stuff must happen not just once, but on a regular basis. And that's why we meet with a group of states from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, of course, and North Carolina, places where states have great concerns, to talk with them on a regular basis in conjunction with all of our federal employees to say, okay, here's what we know today. And what actions are you taking in your state to help address this? And that's vitally important if we're going to tackle this PFAS challenge.
Well, it is. There's no question, and I think it's important to remind everyone that the health advisory levels show that there is no safe amount of exposure. I mean,
that's right.
That's a pretty big deal. No safe exposure. So when you say we need to move forward to phase out chemicals and hold people accountable for cleanup and remediation, that's a whole of government approach, not just state, local, and tribal with the federal government. You talked about it's not regulatory right now. Clearly, we have to have a national drinking water standard. You alluded to that in your answer. So give us an update on where you are in terms of establishing national drinking water standards for PFAS. And then bottom line, what's the timeline? We got to get this done. You expressed a sense of urgency. Where are we in a timeline?
Yeah, and you know, for years now, states have been in the lead of this.
Right. Absolutely.
And part of it is
and Michigan's been a lead in that.
Yeah, and Michigan in particular, both identifying sites that have PFAS, but also in putting in place standards. and regulatory mechanisms. So, you know, for better or worse, there was a gap previously. Now we're working really hard to ensure that we put in place these regulatory standards that allow us to take action in the drinking water arena. We're going to propose those standards by the end of this year. And we're going to have the public response to that. And then by the end of next year, we're going to finalize those standards and have them in place. That's one area we're working in. Another area is to designate PFAS chemicals as hazardous for our CERCLA program, or what we know as Superfund. And why is that important? Well, it's important because if we're to take action in terms of ensuring that polluters and responsible parties that actually put this stuff in the ground actually clean it up, we have to have leverage. Designating these compounds as hazardous for CERCLA will help us do that. So there are a number of areas we have to do it, and that's an impending decision. That's coming up really quickly. So I expect that we'll have that designation in place, which will help us leverage those opportunities. And then we'll use our current enforcement tools as well. As you well know, we have a variety of mechanisms we can use when polluters should be held responsible to take enforcement action. And we're going to engage in that as well. So first step is the regulatory standards for drinking water. We're going to get that done by the end of next year. Second step is hazardous designation for PFAS and PFOA in our CERCLA program. And then the third step is to continue our efforts in enforcement to address this pollution.
So the first step is by the end of next year.
Correct.
The second step by when?
We expect that the hazardous designation is impending. I expect in the next month or so.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
good.
then enforcement along the way.
Great. Good. Ms. Balkas, in light of the new drinking water health advisories that we've been talking about, what steps is the Air Force prepared to take now and quickly, as we've heard the sense of urgency here from Mr. Piggott to deal with our former bases that we have, Wordsmith and KSR, as well as Selfridge Air National Guard Base, other military facilities that we have across the state? What's the Air Force? How's the Air Force responding to that? And what actions are you taking immediately?
Thanks for asking, Chairman Peters. So the Air Force is using the new regional screening levels that EPA issued in May of this year to implement our interim actions, those things that we can do today, even before we get to the remedial investigation step in the CERCLA process. This is going to help us be more protective of human health and the environment, and then define the nature and extent of the contamination. The interim health advisories that Mr. Piggott was explaining helps complicate the designation of PFAS and PFOA as hazardous substances, because almost any water source will then be unable to be used for drinking water. The second dilemma I would highlight is that the interim health advisories are set currently below any method that we can use to detect. And so it's very difficult to determine a clean water source if it's below 4 parts per trillion, which is today's analytical method to be able to identify PFAS compounds. So they're based on draft analyses, which, as Mr. Piggott mentioned, are undergoing review by the EPA Scientific Advisory Board. They are below those detectable limits, and they're non-regulatory at the moment. So we too, from the Air Force, are hand in hand with EPA and are looking forward to having a regulatory standard so that we have that maximum contaminant limit. But what are we doing about it? That's probably the crux of your issue, sir. So
It is.
I want to invite, I want to introduce to you 2 individuals that I invited to join us here today, sir, from Battelle Memorial Institute. Jeff Rose and Amy Vendal are sitting on the front row, sir. They're attending here today at my invitation because they're evaluating a technology demonstration project at Wordsmith this fall. And it could demonstrate 2 of their technologies. So Battelle has identified what they're calling Battelle signature, which is to characterize PFAS compounds related to AFFF, or that firefighting foam, but also non-AFFF sources. And they will couple that with a small scale demonstration of the Battelle annihilator technology. And that will show that they can in fact destroy PFAS in impacted groundwater. And it's very similar to a project that they've already conducted earlier this year, just a few months ago in March in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where they were able to show 99.99% reduction of PFAS on landfill leachate that was at a wastewater treatment facility that's being operated by Heritage Crystal Clean. There was fairly significant news coverage of this great technology, and we are looking forward to partnering with them at Wordsmith. The Annihilator is the first to market for this total solution for PFAS destruction. The supercritical water oxidation technique that was demonstrated is one of the first that can guarantee a 99.99% in the total PFAS and none of the harmful byproducts that are associated with some of the other means of destruction. So I thought it was important to highlight one of the things that we're actually doing in addition to the interim actions that I mentioned in my opening comments. And I wanted to make sure that the audience here knows both Jeff and Amy, and they're happy to answer any additional questions about their technology. But bringing that here, they've already demonstrated it in Grand Rapids, and we're gonna partner to put another demonstration at Wordsmith.
If I could continue with you question, one of the advantages that Michigan has in addressing this PFAS contamination problem is that we do have standards, as was mentioned, that we put in the state. I think it's well documented, though, that the Department of Defense and the Air Force have not publicly committed to meeting those standards in some of their sites here in Michigan. And so my question is pretty straightforward. Do you have any updates or information you can provide whether the Air Force will commit? We'll be on that commit track. We already got you going on that starting at the beginning here. If you will commit to meeting the state of Michigan's PFAS standards here in the state of Michigan.
Chairman Peters, yes, I'm happy to commit, and let me be clear on what I'm committing to.
That's always a good thing. Well on the record.
The Air Force is fully supportive of incorporating Michigan standards into our cleanups. In fact, the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act on our cooperative agreements under CERCLA addresses how, in fact, state standards are used in determining the levels to be attained during cleanup. So an important recent change that has happened is in December 2021, the Department of Defense, so above me and the Department of the Air Force, the Department of Defense issued a new policy that allows the evaluation of state promulgated standards to be used in short-term removal actions as well as in the final remedy that comes after the remedial investigation and feasibility study. So this is really important. It's a slight adjustment to the interpretation that we've been using, but short answer with the long explanation is yes, we are fully supportive of using the Michigan standards in the cleanup phase and also in our upcoming interim remedial actions.
Good. Well, you mentioned the studies and the ongoing studies, and all this happens at the conclusion of that. But I think in terms of Wordsmith, I think we're in the 13th year now of a study of investigation. And after 13 years of investigation, there's still no cleanup plan in place. The Air Force has indicated that it's going to take another 2 to 5 years before such a plan is adopted. And I think I speak for everybody who lives around that area that this is simply unacceptable to have that kind of timeline. It's time to get to work after all of that timeline. And we've talked about how we want to accelerate this, and certainly we've heard that from the panelists. So what's the Air Force doing to bring a more urgent and timely action, including any efforts to coordinate with state and local that are obviously very engaged in this issue? How can we speed this up? And you're free to make any commitments again.
Chairman Peters, we're doing a lot of work at Wordsmith, and I have to also follow the law and be a good steward of taxpayer dollars. So within those boundaries, we are taking very aggressive action to implement cleanup processes before we get to the remedial investigation and feasibility study stages of CERCLA, which is a law that we must follow. So let me give you a few examples of what we have done. So only one well so far has been found to have concentrations on Wort Smith that were above the 2016 health advisory levels. And in that case, the Air Force immediately provided bottled water to the resident and then arranged for connection to the municipal drinking water system. In addition, since the remedial investigation started in July of 2020, we are well along the way, and John can certainly go into more detail about where we are in the remedial investigation, but we've already conducted 5 different interim removal actions, 5. Let me be a little more specific about where they are. So at fire training area number 2, there we installed a pump and treat system near Clark's Marsh. Number 2, at Arrow Street, which is SS 21, at Benzene, which is site number 6, and at Mission Street, which is OT number 24. We've expanded those already existing pump and treat systems to add PFAS and PFOA treatment at those 3 locations that were already addressing those other contaminants. And then number 5, we have removed over 24,000 cubic yards of PFAS impacted soil that was beneath the fire training area near Clark's Marsh. There are 3 more that we are going to do in addition to Battelle's commitment to do additional action in the fall. The fire training area at Clark's Marsh, which I mentioned, we're going to further expand that pump and treat system, and it goes online next week. Second, Van Etten Lake at Ken Ratliff Memorial Park. We've installed a pump and treat system there, and it's scheduled for completion next month. And then third, the aircraft apron AFFF release site at Van Etten Lake near Pierce's Point will also be installing a pump and treat system. And then finally, a pilot project that we're preparing to award in September will be a pilot using fluorosorb material that will treat PFAS in stormwater. And then it's in the 3 Pipes ditch, which ultimately discharges to the Au Sable River. So combined with what Battelle Memorial Institute is doing, I am very proud of all of these initiatives that are ongoing now today, showing that we are taking action and reducing PFAS. We are not only studying, sir, we are also doing cleanup and removal.
So you mentioned in the beginning that these are standards in 2016. Now with the new advisory with the state law, how has that changed? How's it changed what you're doing?
We will have to go back to some of our sites to look at the data we already have to verify if there were detections below that 70 parts per trillion.
Which is likely.
I will agree on that point. And we will.
So when were you going to go back and do that?
We're in the process of doing that right now. We're already looking at the data we already have, and then we will follow it up with additional field sampling to be able to verify what those detections are.
How long does that take?
So we're, I would imagine, probably in the next few months. So we already have the infrastructure in place where we, across the country at our installations, where we went out and we looked at if we had a really good hydro-geo CSM, we knew where the groundwater was leaving the base, and we also knew where the surface water would either come off the base or bypass the base and maybe pick up some PFAS. So we sampled those areas using the 2016 health advisory, and we would go out until we got half of the HA, so 35. So right now we're doubling up our efforts and we're going out further. We're re-looking at the information we had with the standard of analysis we have, which we can measure down to 4, right? And now we're going out and further past that area. So some areas it wasn't very far off base before it really dropped off. Other areas it could go out 2-3 miles. And at one area it went down, we chased it down a river system 15 miles. So that's what we're doing right now, sir. And we're really gearing up to go back out and resample around all our installations.
And you said that takes several months?
I would say to get all the bases done, sir, yes. It's going to take a few months. Yes, sir. And sir, I would like to say one thing, a question too, is as we look at our entire portfolio at across the Air Force, Wordsmith does have the most interim remedies of any installation we have. The RI, thanks to you, sir, we got a plus up, right? The RI was awarded back in July 2020. And I'm not going to sit here and make excuses for contracting why it takes after that's awarded a year to get out in the field. We got to figure that one out, right? But so have we been studying PFAS for 13 years at Wordsmith? I wouldn't say it was that long, sir. Thanks to Eagle, really, who was forward leaning on this, we were able to have a lot of information to make the decisions we made with those interim measures before we even started our RI. And now the interim measure we're doing now, which really I'm very happy about, because it's kind of personal to me in two ways. One, Ken Ratcliffe loaned me the money to buy my first car when I was 18. He retired from the Air Force and worked at the Wordsmith Federal Credit Union. Second, though, that where that enters Van Etten Lake is after we discovered TCE, and I was there in 1977. We switched the well field over to that area. And unbeknownst to anybody, that's the area that was probably being impacted, wells 4 and 5, by PFAS. When I looked at the well fields at KI Sawyer, wells 4, 5, 9, and 10, they did not appear to be impacted by PFAS at all over the years.
Well, we got to stay on it, clearly,
Yes, sir.
and not just stay on it, but accelerate it. So I think that's part of your commitment is we're going to accelerate that.
Yeah, yes, sir. And if I may say something, sir, these interim measures, and I think we stated pretty clearly in all our documents, this is just a tourniquet on the patient right now.
Okay,
That's all it is.
right.
We have got a lot of work to do on the interior of that base. But right now, let's get the tourniquets on so we can stop the PFAS, the uncontrolled release of PFAS from our installations.
And then remediate.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely. Dr. Pricey, although we know an awful lot of the impacts of PFAS on human health, there's still a whole lot we don't know. And so what more needs to be done to achieve a more complete understanding of the impact of PFAS on our health and our communities?
Sure. So if you follow the literature on PFAS, it's quite remarkable actually how much is being published on PFAS every month. There are literally dozens of papers, if not more, every month. So that's the degree to which the data on the health effects are accelerating. Not all those publications on health effects, but many of them are. However, most of the data comes from studies in toxicology, in animals, and in cell systems. I think the big need for PFAS is human epidemiology. We need the evidence in humans, in particular, so we can understand what we would call an exposure response relationship. How much in the water, how much in the body results in how much disease. That information can be used to more effectively set safe standards, safe levels going forward. And so what we think is needed is expansion in the effort in human epidemiology, looking at the health effects in people. Now, that's going to be a big effort because an epi study to look at a thyroid disorder is not the same thing as to look at cancer risk. It's not the same thing to look at cholesterol levels and cardiovascular disease. All these different endpoints would require different designs, different approaches going forward. So we're calling for an increased emphasis in the human epidemiology to support our understanding of the relationship between the exposure and the disease.
So there's a lot to know. You say the literature is increasing. We have to probably coordinate to make sure that we are actually answering all the questions that have to be asked instead of focusing on one or two. As important as those are, you need to have a better picture. So if you could give me a sense of what work the ATSDR is doing with other federal agencies, states, to look at the impacts on health and human health, as you mentioned, but particularly the long term, because these are going to have to be long-term studies. Give me a sense of where we are, where we need to go.
Yeah, so the other the two principal agencies that are involved in research on the human side of things are the Environmental Protection Agency, because they're experts at measuring how much is in the environment. The National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, part of NIH, also funds a lot of external research organizations to do research on that, and then ourselves. So we all work closely to try and understand the types of projects that are being funded, the type of work that's being done. We're collaborating now with NIEHS on a health study. We're collaborating with the EPA on an expanded exposure study, so we understand the different routes that people might get exposed to. Even in a situation where there's principal water exposure, there's still other things that are contributing to that exposure. Understanding what those are important also, in part so we can look at the complex exposure as we try and relate that to disease, but also so we understand what's the biggest opportunity for reducing exposure. We want to tackle all those routes as where they're possible there, and especially those that we think are associated with exposure. So there's a broad interest across the federal government on the human health side of things, and principally it's ourselves, EPA and NIEHS, focusing on that.
Well, given the new advisory where any level is harmful, and given the levels that we're seeing in PFAS in some of our lakes and rivers and streams here in Michigan, how concerned are you about fish in the Great Lakes region?
So that's not principally our responsibility in HSDR, other than we follow closely what the state and local advisories are for consumption, which rely heavily on data I think that the EPA and other environmental agencies produce in terms of contamination going forward. And so what we would do is we try and follow those, we identify them, and where they're present, we incorporate them in all our community outreach materials. And when we have our community outreach meetings, we talk about what those advisories are and why they're important and why they should be followed.
So those advisories been adjusted given the new levels we're talking about, but basically any level is unsafe.
I would be surprised if they had been at this point, because those advisory levels are pretty recent.
So there would be some concern there.
Absolutely. As surface water is contamination, I think we're worried about that. And other animal species as well can get contaminated based on grazing experiences and stuff. So it's not just fish that are potentially a concern.
Across the board. You're shaking your hands, Greg.
Yeah,
Please elaborate.
If it's okay, I'd just love to add, we because of the concerns about the aquatic life, one of the things we've done is release aquatic life criteria. And we've been working in conjunction, of course, with ATSDR on the scientific end in terms of all the things you mentioned, but also we've been working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to determine how do we characterize the fish tissue analysis. And as Eagle does and all the states, you collect fish and you take a core sample from the fish and analyze it to determine, well, what are the levels of pollutants in that fish and are they of concern? And that's one of the things we've been working on, why we established water quality criteria, to ensure that not only are we protecting the vitally important drinking water that we all consume, but also that the aquatic life that we're covering is protected as well. And the way that happens is that we establish water quality criteria, which states then can use to develop their own criteria and limits they put on wastewater treatment plants to ensure that we not only get the PFAS out of our drinking water, but also remove it from our wastewater that goes into our waterways. And so those criteria are really critical. And that fish study is really vital to determining those levels.
Well, I appreciate you brought up that criteria. And there's actually a question I was going to ask related to criteria for PFOA and PFAS. And what specifically would you recommend Michigan and other states do to be in a position to actually implement these recommendations that you just talked about?
Well, in terms of the criteria, one of the things that we look forward to the states doing is adopting the criteria in the state regulatory process. So that's one recommendation we'd have, is we've got the criteria out there, they're helpful, and then Michigan can use them to adopt them into their regulatory mechanisms, and then include monitoring provisions in their wastewater permits around the state to ensure that we know what's coming out of the wastewater treatment plant, and then we can treat for that. Right now, Michigan has been far and away in the lead in terms of determining what is in their drinking water and looking at the different sources. And so it wouldn't surprise me to hear, and I do know, in fact, that Michigan not only has looked at what's come out of our wastewater treatment plant, but where's it coming from that gets to our wastewater treatment plant? And they've conducted an extensive study upstream of different industrial contributors to determine where it's coming from. And I think that's another vital part that actually other states in the country could do and are not doing currently to ensure that we know and then treat for the PFAS that's coming out of our wastewater systems.
Well, as I continue this line of questioning with you, is that as the states are working to do that and to implement it, and you're working with it, it's always a resource issue, is always a challenge. But as you know, and I think you actually alluded to it in your opening comments, that the infrastructure law that we passed just recently had $5 billion in grant funding for states to address PFAS and other emerging contaminants as well. But certainly PFAS is a focus of that in terms of drinking fund. Could you describe for the committee's benefit what steps the EPA has taken to ensure that the grant funding actually aligns with the on-the-ground needs and follows the guidance that you're putting forward? What should we expect and when should we expect it?
Such a great question, Senator Peters. It's the money that comes to the states from the bipartisan infrastructure law is being run through the state revolving fund program in each state. So the states will receive the allocations. Michigan's receiving, I think, $22 million for their PFAS work this year. And then the states put together what they call intended use plans that identify the communities that they're going to distribute those dollars to. And the communities themselves, we are standing up technical assistance to work with those communities to ensure that they, A, know about the money that's out there, B, have the appropriate technical tools necessary to apply for those dollars, and then get them, especially for the disadvantaged communities, in the form of grants. And so the states are a critical partner in ensuring that we get the money out to our communities. And Michigan has been devoted not only with PFAS, but also with lead service line replacements to ensure that dollars go out to the disadvantaged communities that so desperately need them to ensure that we protect our drinking water, whether it's lead or PFAS. And that money is distributed by the federal government. And we're constantly in touch and examine the list of communities that those dollars go out to ensure that they're properly distributed in the way that was intended under the bipartisan infrastructure law.
Right. And we'll want to be in regular communications about how that's going and how we can facilitate all of that. So
yes, and we look forward to that.
Please continue to work with us on that.
I'm happy to do so.
Appreciate that. Ms. Valkes, as we wrap up this panel, you've been in such a great mood to commit. I've got a few commit questions for you here. And this has been about improving interagency cooperation and coordination, and you've certainly committed to that, which I appreciate as we move forward. I've got a few specific questions, though, that folks want to have answers to. First, can you explain why Oscoda community members can no longer attend base closure team meetings at the former Wordsmith Air Force Base?
Chairman Peters, I'd be happy to answer that question. So the BRAC cleanup team meetings are intended to be a regulator and regulatee meeting. So it is not open to the public. That's to enable us to have those very frank and honest conversations about what the geology is showing us, what the groundwater flow is doing, what our proposed plans are, what the sampling is showing us, et cetera. So in that format, it is between the Air Force and the state of Michigan, or the Eagle team. And not that I wanted to state this necessarily, but I think it's important to say that, we're following the Defense Environmental Restoration Program rules on that. So it's not something that the Air Force came up with on our own. It is our policies and practices. However, We do highly encourage our community to be involved in the environmental restoration process through the Restoration Advisory Board meetings, or RABs. And the one that's at Wordsmith is phenomenal. They are actively involved. They are passionate advocates for their community, and they provide great insights to what we are doing and what we could do moving forward. Additionally, those BRAC cleanup team meetings are summarized in Restoration Advisory Board meetings. And sometimes those BRAC or BRAC cleanup team members are also members of the RAB. And so there's an opportunity for community members to interact with the BRAC cleanup team members in that open forum. So all of that to say, the BRAC cleanup team is regulator and regulatee, and our community members are invited to every Restoration Advisory Board meeting. And as I committed earlier today to you, Chairman Peters, we will do a community meeting where I will bring in experts as many times as we need to until we're able to answer all of the community's questions.
So you mentioned some of the hurdles to be in the base closure team meetings, but is there, do you see a way that there could be more involvement despite the issues that you raised?
Sir, I think the BRAC cleanup team needs to remain between the regulators and the Air Force. That's where we need to be able to discuss policies, practices, plans, and procedures.
So there's no way to find some way for the public opinion or the residents' opinion in the area?
There is plenty of ways for the public to
Within that
provide
meeting,
their
I'm sorry,
opinion.
within that meeting.
Not in the BRAC cleanup team, sir, but yes, in community meetings and restoration advisory boards.
And so you're going to take full public or opportunities for the public to have input on a remedial investigation work plan? You will, I hear you've already committed to that. So you're going to take that
Yes.
kind of input on a regular basis?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I would propose that we do is to do earlier release of our draft remedial investigation documents, so that they're not waiting until it becomes final. So that's a premier way for community members to have a voice earlier in the process.
Well, part of having a voice is you have to have access to some documents and data clearly, so you can comment on that. And Oscoda community members have learned that the DoD regularly provides documents and data to state regulators via a publicly inaccessible portal. So my request for another commitment is, would you commit to making this information more readily available to the impacted communities so that they can make a thoughtful comment based on documents and data?
Yes, that's one of the initiatives that we are planning to implement. So the reason that it's a secure website between the regulated and the regulator parties is so that we can reach agreements on what needs to be done. But in the interim, going forward, our intention is to make sure that those remedial investigation work plans are available and accessible to the communities. I'll see if Mr. Gillespie would like to elaborate.
Yeah, so I stayed up pretty late last night reading all the community's comments
Good.
on the last interim measure we're taking, and they were really good. They were very good. And so I think 30 days is not enough. I agree with Ms. Balkus, is not enough to give our community members input on that. I think we gave them 30 days, maybe a little bit longer, but it wasn't much.
So now I have to pick up on that comment, that they were good comments that you had,
Yeah.
public comments. As you read them late last night, what stood out to you? We're like, wow, this is really great comments. These are the kinds of things I'm glad I'm hearing here tonight.
Yeah,
or reading.
so sir, I think one of the things we haven't done a great job with at Wordsmith is there's been so many maps put out there by either by Eagle, by the Air Force, by somebody else, that over the years that show these plume blobs, right? And I would, and you know, the Air Force would answer back to the community members saying, how come your map doesn't match with Eagle's? And so what version is they talking about? You know, what's the latest plume map? In other words, myself, I'm old school. I don't want a machine to contour my groundwater table, and I don't want a machine to contour my plume maps. I want a professional to do that. And I don't know whether Eagle does that or the Air Force contractor did that. But as I interject myself as a technical person to our BRAC team, that will stop. And I would hope my Eagle counterparts, a lot of them graduated from this great university too, right? I hope they are not using some program to contour maps either.
And the comments, other comments you read last night, anything that
Well,
stood out?
that was one of them. And then a lot of them where people were, using lawyer speak was, hey, one thing about these interim remedies is you get another bite at the apple, right? In other words, this is not the final remedy. As I said before, this is a tourniquet. We're putting on this uncontrolled release of PFAS from our installations. We have a lot of work to do on the internal plumes yet. And so I think part of the disappointment with the community is we did not do a lot of work on the internal plumes. For example, I would call it the old Air Force Beach plume, now Ken Ratliff Park, right? But I'm not going to use Ken's name, match it up with a plume. That plume is very well defined, where the mass is about 3,000 feet in from the lake shore. However, when I look at the well spacing then, and it's really good on the lake shore, the definition, where they're putting in the extraction wells. But I had 1,000 feet of space where we have massive plume, Enders Lake, Van Etten. I had 1,000 feet between 2 points. And so we need to do it. So we need more information there. And I think that's what we were trying to get across in some of the comments. I did not address those comments, but I think that's what we were trying to get across. Hey, we got a ways to go, but before we start plume busting on the internal part of that plume. Let's stop according to the surface water bodies. But let's start thinking about, with the technologies that we have off the shelf and that are coming on the shelf soon, so we can start learning how we're going to cut up that plume.
Okay, well, good. The conversation will continue with all four of you. Thank you to all four of our witnesses here today. Thank you for your work on this issue. I know you're passionate on the issue. This is not a problem going away anytime soon. So we're going to be talking an awful lot in the months and years ahead as we work together. We appreciate your willingness to be a part of the solution and working diligently to get to that point where we can get to the other side of this crisis.